Welcome to this trip through one of the most disturbing stories ever told in the Appalachian Mountains. Please comment on where you're watching from right now, because what we're going to talk about goes beyond any story you've ever heard. This video is a made-up story meant only to entertain. There is no connection between this and real people, living or dead. There is a place where the mountains touch the sky with stone fingers and the mist moves between the valleys like something alive, like something that breathes. There was a place in Kentucky that old maps didn't name. It was far from the roads that crisscrossed the country. People who traveled through those areas whispered about a hidden property that was surrounded by trees so thick that they blocked the sun even at noon. The Harlows lived there. Their name carried the weight of many dark secrets that had been passed down through the generations. The property was in a hidden fold of the mountains that could only be reached by a dirt road that wound its way between steep rocks and icy streams. People who walked by in the fall heard the wind howl in a different way, as if nature itself stayed away from that piece of land. People in the area knew the Harlows, but not in a way that anyone would want to be remembered. Rumors that no one would dare confirm out loud spread their reputation across whole counties. It all started decades ago when the head of the family, a man with a piercing gaze and a heavy silence, moved into that long-forgotten valley. He came alone, with no bags or stories about where he came from. He made his house with his own hands, using wood from the trees he cut down and stones he dug up from the rocky ground. The house grew slowly, adding strange rooms, staircases that went nowhere, and doors that stayed locked from the inside. People who went to that property said they came back changed, with something in their eyes that they couldn't explain. The Harlows stayed away from the rest of the world. They didn't go to the nearby villages very often, and when they did, they always did it in complete silence. They only bought what they needed, paid with old coins, and left before anyone could talk to them. It was like they were moving in a way that was stiff and fake, as if every move was planned to show nothing but the most important things. People stopped asking questions. When they saw a member of that family on the dusty streets of the small towns, they learned to look away. Over time, stories began to pile up like dry leaves on the ground in the woods. They talked about strange lights that blinked in the house's windows in the early morning, sounds that didn't belong to any known animal, and figures that walked across the grounds when the moon was full. Some people said they had seen shapes moving between the trees, and there were always more of them than a single family should have. When the wind blew from the north, people said they could smell something that made their stomachs churn, like churned earth and something else. A merchant who was passing through the area in 1902 wrote in his personal diary about a conversation he heard in a local tavern. A group of men were quietly talking about how the Harlows never seemed to get older like other people. Time went by, but that family stayed the same, as if time had passed over them without leaving any deep marks. It was impossible to tell how many people actually lived there. The numbers never made sense. There were times when it looked like there were only 4 or 5 people, and other times when there were dozens of different faces in the windows. Back then, newspapers didn't talk about the Harlows directly, but their name came up a lot in stories about strange things happening in the area. County records had strange inconsistencies, like property documents signed by people who should have been dead for decades, certificates listing births without exact dates, and marriages between family members that made no sense at all. It was as if the bureaucracy itself bowed down to them because it couldn't figure out how to put the truth into understandable groups. People didn't know what really happened inside that house, but everyone agreed that the Harlows were very wrong. Something that went beyond what people usually thought, that didn't make sense, and that thrived on the unknown. And this feeling that something evil lived in those mountains would only get stronger over time, as its rotten roots spread deeper into the cursed land of the Appalachians. The Harlow estate covered a lot of land, and wound its way through hills covered in thick, hostile plants. People didn't really respect the boundaries set by rotten wooden fences because no one dared to get close enough to test them. The trees around the house grew crooked, and their branches twisted together in ways that went against nature, as if something unseen was shaping them according to an unknown will. Inside that house, life followed rules that no one else could understand. The Harlows followed customs that seemed to come from a time when the rules of civilization hadn't yet reached those faraway mountains. They grew their own food in gardens that thrived even when frost killed everything else around them. They kept animals that people didn't see very often. At night, their sounds echoed through the property, making a creepy symphony of bleats, grunts, and howls. Over the years, the people who lived in the nearby villages had developed a strange instinct. They knew exactly when to stay off certain roads, when to keep the windows shut even in the summer heat, and when not to ask about travelers who had been through the area and were never seen again. People who lived in the shadow of those mountains all knew what to do without saying anything. People shouldn't talk about the Harlows in public. But not everyone could stop themselves from being curious. Every now and then, someone would choose to look into it on their own. They were always outsiders, new to the area, and not yet aware of how important that name was. They would leave during the day, following the winding path that led to the property with only their bravery and lack of knowledge. Some would come back before nightfall, looking pale and shaking, and wouldn't talk about what they had seen. Some people just vanished into the mountains, where the fog never really went away. In 1908, the situation in the area got very tense. People said that there were nightly meetings on the Harlow property, when the moon was hidden behind the clouds and it was the darkest time of night. Witnesses said they saw groups of hooded people walking in a line across the grounds, each carrying a lantern that gave off a strange, almost greenish light. The noises that came from that place at night were different from what you would normally hear. They were a mix of chants in languages you didn't know and beats that made the ground shake. People who were brave enough to tell the stories said that the family kept a library in their house. These books weren't normal. They were bound in materials that no one could figure out and had pages covered in symbols that hurt the eyes of anyone who tried to read them. These books held knowledge that was illegal in other places. The Harlows protected this knowledge with fanatical zeal, passing it down from generation to generation as if it were more valuable than gold. Family members didn't often talk to each other in a way that seemed normal. There were no jokes or light-hearted fights. They talked to each other in quiet voices, with meaningful glances, and with gestures that were so small that they sounded like the wind. It was like they had made up their own language that outsiders couldn't understand, shaped by years of being alone and sharing secrets. They also had strange collections of things that took up whole rooms in the house. These included bottles with liquids of impossible colors, metal tools that looked like surgical tools but had no known purpose, and mirrors that showed distorted images even when no one was standing in front of them. Each item had its own story and role in the sad tapestry that the Harlows wove over and over again. The seasons came and went, but the property stayed the same. The rest of the world moved on, welcoming progress and modernity. But that small part of Kentucky seemed stuck in a scary, distant past. The Harlows didn't care about the changes happening in the country. They lived outside of normal time, stuck in a never-ending cycle of rituals and traditions that had a higher meaning that most people couldn't understand. And on the darkest nights, when even the animals in the woods were too scared to make a sound, lights kept dancing in the windows of that cursed house. Behind the torn curtains, shadows moved and made gestures that looked like old rituals, blood oaths, and promises made to beings that lived outside of reality. The Harlows stayed on their dark path, not caring about the fear they caused, or the fact that they were trying to keep something alive that the world had forgotten or chosen to ignore. The years dragged on across the mountains like thick fog, and the Harlows' reputation grew to almost mythical levels. There was something about the way that family worked that made it impossible to understand logically. It was like they had made a deal with the mountains themselves, a deal that promised to keep them safe in exchange for something no one could name. The house itself seemed to be alive, breathing with the seasons and groaning under the weight of its own secrets. Even when there was no wind, the wood creaked, the doors opened and closed in their own time, and rooms moved around depending on who was looking for them. People who were not welcome and got into the property reported strange things happening. Hallways that went on longer than they should have, staircases that led to floors that didn't exist, and windows that showed landscapes that didn't match what was outside. The Harlows worked hard to keep their mysterious air. They never explained anything, defended themselves, or showed any interest in being understood or accepted. This attitude of not caring what other people thought made it possible for rumors and legends to spread without any checks. People saw every silence as proof. Every unclear gesture led to more rumors. There was an invisible hierarchy among them, a power structure that worked through unspoken rules. Some family members seemed to get more respect than others, but it was impossible to tell who really led that secretive group. There may not have been one leader, but rather a group mind, a shared will that guided their actions as if they were all parts of a larger organism. There were more and more stories about their powers. People said that the Harlows could tell when storms were coming days in advance, make plants grow in dry soil, and that their looks could heal or hurt people depending on what they wanted. Some people said they didn't sleep like normal people do. Instead, they went into deep trances where their spirits roamed the mountains and watched everything that happened in their territory. The winter of 1915 was especially harsh in the area. The snow was so thick in the valleys that it cut off a number of communities from the rest of the world. While everyone else was having a hard time staying warm in the cold, the Harlow estate stayed strangely untouched. The snow around its lands melted faster than anywhere else, as if the ground gave off its own heat. The chimneys always let out dark smoke that made shapes in the sky that looked like they were drawing old symbols before they disappeared. During that long winter, strange things started to happen in the villages nearby. Tools would go missing from workshops and then show up days later in places that were impossible to reach. Farm animals were born with strange markings on their skin that looked like writing in a language that was no longer spoken. People had the same scary dreams, seeing dark hallways and doors that shouldn't be opened. During those cold weeks, the Harlows moved around the area more often than usual. They showed up in markets covered in snow, buying strange amounts of rock salt, black candles, and herbs that no one knew what they were for. They paid a lot, always in old coins that the merchants took without question. They were scared but couldn't say why. Anyone who tried to ask questions about that family had their words freeze in their throats. There were many layers of history on the property. Every new generation of Harlows adds their own secrets to the already heavy foundation. There were basements that went deeper than what normal buildings would allow, and there were tunnels that snaked under the mountains to connect faraway parts of the land. The family did their most secret things in these underground places, away from prying eyes. They kept traditions alive that went back to before those lands were colonized. The Harlows weren't just a family. They were protectors of something bigger, knowledge that people had chosen to forget. They all had pieces of this secret knowledge, and together they were a living library of dark knowledge. They read texts that made their eyes bleed, practiced arts that changed reality, and kept in touch with beings that lived on the edge of the visible world and the worlds that lay beyond. And so, from one generation to the next, they kept weaving their thick web of mystery around those cursed mountains. Harlow was a name that meant everything that was strange and confusing, It was a constant reminder that there were still places where normal rules didn't apply, where ancient powers ruled over the land and its people. The Appalachian Mountains have a different flow of time, especially as you get closer to the Harlow estate. Days seem to last longer than they should, and nights are darker than they are anywhere else. That piece of land seemed to be in a different dimension, only touching our world in a small way. The family came up with their own ways to stay alive that had nothing to do with what other people did. Their gardens were full of plants that shouldn't grow in that climate. Strange types with leaves that were impossible colors and flowers that smelled amazing. These plants were planted in very specific geometric patterns that made designs that could only be fully appreciated from above, as if they were messages sent to the sky. The Harlows had a strange relationship with the natural world. When thunder ripped through the sky in other places, their property stayed completely calm. While drought destroyed fields nearby, their land stayed wet and fertile. It was like they had made a deal with nature to protect them from the problems that were bothering everyone else. The family members were able to talk to each other without using words. They moved together perfectly, like dancers practicing a dance that had been passed down through the generations. When one Harlow reached out, the other one already knew what they were going to ask. Everyone knew what it meant when someone looked in a certain direction right away. This strong bond made it seem like they weren't separate people, but rather different parts of the same broken mind. The calendars they used for their rituals didn't match any known system. They used the movement of certain stars to mark dates, which happened in cycles of decades or centuries. On these special days, the whole property seemed to be full of energy, with waves of force that bent the air and made the ground shake gently under the feet of anyone who dared to be there. A stranger came to the mountains in 1923 with scientific tools and a plan to figure out the secrets of the Harlows. He set up camp on a nearby hill so he could see the property without being seen. He spent weeks noting movement patterns, recording glowing events, and trying to map out the house's strange, ever-changing shape. His notes got more and more jumbled, and his handwriting turned into scribbles that were impossible to read. Finally, in the middle of the night, he just left, leaving behind all of his tools and papers. The Harlows didn't have to fight back on purpose. Just being there gave them a lot of power over anyone who tried to get in their way. It was like the world around them was more flexible, changing in small but clear ways to fit their needs. Doors that should have been open wouldn't budge when you tried to open them. Paths that led to the property turned into confusing mazes all of a sudden. It seemed like the geography itself was working against them to keep their secrets safe. The walls of the house showed signs of wear and tear from many generations. They weren't just scratches or regular stains. They were complicated symbols carved into the wood, paintings that glowed softly in the dark, and patterns that changed depending on how you looked at them. Each mark told a story, marked an important event, sealed a deal, or celebrated a success in the family's secret arts. The Harlow family library was their most valuable possession. The books there held knowledge that had been gathered over hundreds of years, wisdom that had been driven out of other places, burned in cleansing bonfires or buried in hidden tombs. But the Harlows kept everything, keeping the traditions that the world wanted to forget alive. People treated each book with great care, covering it with special covers and keeping it in a way that would keep it safe for a long time. There were also the glass panes. There were a lot of them in the house, but they weren't normal things. They showed more than just pictures of things. People who stared at those shiny surfaces for too long started to see things that weren't real, like flashes of other times, echoes of things that hadn't happened yet, or things that belonged to different versions of reality. The Harlows used these mirrors for things that no one else could understand, like rituals that involved long periods of thought and chanting in dead languages. Animals in the area naturally stayed away from the property. Birds changed their migration routes so they wouldn't have to fly over those areas. Even when they were starving, wolves and bears stayed a respectful distance away. Only the animals that worked for the Harlows were allowed to roam freely across the land. They looked like normal animals, but they acted in strange ways, as if they were physical forms of the family's will. And so the story kept getting bigger, thanks to every new mystery, every strange event, and every secret shared in the nearby villages. The Harlows stayed in the middle of it all, still as the mountains that surrounded them. They were the keepers of secrets that made the dark around them even darker and harder to see through. The seasons kept going around the mountains, but the Harlow estate seemed to be outside of this natural flow. That place had a timeless quality to it. It was as if every stone, tree, and inch of soil had taken in so much of that family spirit that it now acted as an extension of their will. The older members of the family had a strange look in their eyes, an intensity that seemed to cut through the surface of things and see deeper levels of reality. When they talked, their voices sounded strange, as if many people were saying the same thing at the same time. This trait became stronger during nightly ceremonies when the whole house vibrated with energies that made the air thick and hard to breathe. The building's design went against all rules of good construction. Some angles made the towers look completely invisible, even though they were taller than the trees around them. There were annexes that were linked to the main building by covered walkways. The paths that went between them were so complicated that they broke basic geometric rules. Anyone who tried to map the area found that the drawings never matched what they saw later, as if the house were always changing. The Harlows had a huge collection of ancient things, like tools used in practices that official history would rather not talk about, artifacts that belonged to civilizations that are now long gone, and relics of cults that are no longer around. The family's life was guided by a complicated set of beliefs and rituals, and each item had a specific role to play in that system. Some were put on special pedestals, some were kept in strong chests, and some had to stay buried on the property, with only small stones with symbols on them marking their presence. In 1931, the whole area went quiet for a strange reason. For weeks, the Harlow estate was silent. Not even the usual smoke came out of its chimneys. People in the nearby villages watched this quiet with growing worry, sensing that something important was happening, that something big was changing in those cursed lands. When signs of life came back, the air around the estate changed in a small but noticeable way, as if a new layer of mystery had been added to the ones that were already there. The family made their own kinds of art, things that were different from anything else in the world. They used pigments from rare minerals found deep in local caves to paint canvases. The pictures looked like they were moving when you looked at them from the side. They carved wood into shapes that were hard to see, things that looked different depending on how the person was feeling. They made music with instruments they designed themselves, and the sounds made people move without thinking about it. The gardens around the house had patterns that changed with the seasons, but not in the way that was expected. Some plants bloomed in the winter with flowers that were too strong to be real. Some went into a deep sleep in the summer. There was a different set of rules that made sense only in the context of Harlow's worldview that governed that ecosystem. They grew food, but they also did it as part of their rituals, planting each seed according to strict rules and harvesting at times that were very important to them. The family kept very detailed records of everything that happened on the property. Diaries written in complicated codes recorded both normal and unusual events, treating both with the same cold, clinical seriousness. These records built up in neat piles in the safest parts of the house, creating a living archive of the secret history of that cursed family. Each generation added its own pages to a story that lasted for hundreds of years. At times, the line between the property and the outside world became very thin. On these rare occasions, strange things were reported in faraway places. Lights that couldn't be explained danced across the fields. People heard whispers in empty houses. Shadows moved on their own, separate from where they came from. The Harlows never said anything about these things, but they seemed happy with how much power they had. The animals that worked for the family started acting more and more strangely. Crows sat on the roofs of the house in perfect geometric shapes. Black cats walked around the grounds all the time, and their eyes shone with an unnatural intelligence. It looked like even the bugs were following silent orders, making clouds that moved in the air in complicated ways before breaking up. The Harlows' fame had grown from being known only in their own town to becoming a legend that spread across the state and beyond. People who traveled told stories about that evil family to people who were interested in them in faraway taverns. Writers tried to put the heart of that mystery into words, but they always failed because they found that the true nature of the Harlows could not be fully described. It was like there were parts of their lives that couldn't be put into words that most people could understand. At the center of it all, the house stayed strong and unchanging, a reminder of the forces that the modern world would rather ignore. Its walls held secrets that no amount of investigation could uncover. The mysteries were so deeply embedded in its structure that taking one apart would mean destroying the other. The Harlows kept doing their strange things, not caring about the passage of time, and focused on goals that were beyond human understanding. Like layers of dust on old furniture, decades piled up on the Harlow property, each one leaving its mark, even if it couldn't be seen. The family lived in a strange way, seemingly unaffected by the changes that were happening in the rest of the country. While the rest of the world moved forward, that remote part of Kentucky stayed stuck in traditions that seemed to come from a long time ago and were no longer relevant. The house had grown in ways that made no sense at all over the years. New rooms seemed to appear out of nowhere. They were additions that didn't make sense from an architectural point of view, but they fit in perfectly with the rest of the building. There were rooms that could only be reached at certain times of day, when the sun hit them at just the right angle and showed hidden pathways. There were cellars inside cellars, and each deeper level went deeper into the mountain's core. No one could explain how they were carved into living rock. Over the years, the Harlows learned a lot about the natural forces that were all around them in those mountains. Even during the worst droughts, they knew where underground water veins flowed. They knew about hidden caves that went for miles below the surface. These caves made a complicated system of natural tunnels that linked faraway parts of the land. They learned everything there was to know about plants that only grew in complete darkness, and those that changed when they were grown away from sunlight. There was an unspoken division of tasks among the family members. Some people worked hard to grow and harvest crops, taking care of the gardens according to calendars that no one else could understand. Others kept the house clean and safe by doing rituals that strengthened the invisible walls around the property. Some people had the job of reading old texts, figuring out symbols that had been lost, and translating manuscripts in dead languages that held forbidden knowledge. The library had grown a lot, and now took up several rooms connected by narrow hallways. The bookshelves went all the way up to the ceiling, and you had to use mobile ladders to get to the top books. There were whole sections of books about strange subjects like dark botany, arcane astronomy, impossible geometries, and the nature of consciousness and how to change it. Each book was a special treasure, and many of them were one-of-a-kind copies that no one else in the world had. There were also more mirrors on the property. They covered whole walls in some rooms, making effects of infinite reflection that messed with the senses and made it hard to tell where things were. The Harlows used these mirrors for meditation, sitting in front of them for hours without moving and entering altered states of consciousness that let them access hidden knowledge. They said that these mirrors could show not only a person's own reflection, but also different versions of that person, paths that weren't taken, and possibilities that weren't realized. In 1947, the area had a number of strange weather events that couldn't be explained. Storms would come out of nowhere and go away just as quickly. Lightning hit the ground in perfect geometric patterns, leaving scars that could be seen for weeks. The Harlow property was always at the center of these events, as if it were a spark that set off natural forces that were usually dormant. The family went about their normal lives during these events, completely ignoring the chaos that was going on around them. Over time, the rituals they did became more and more complicated. They weren't celebrations in the usual sense. They were complicated ceremonies that required a lot of planning and careful execution. People used special materials that glowed faintly in the dark to draw circles on the ground. The flames of the candles danced without any wind, and they were arranged in certain patterns. People sang chants together, and their voices blended in harmonies that seemed to echo in the air and in the bones of those who were close by. The family had a strong connection to the seasons, but they saw this cycle in a different way. Each season had its own meaning for them in terms of their practices. It was time to plant not just physical seeds in the spring, but also goals and wishes that would grow over the next few months. Summer was a time of growth and expansion, when people studied and tried new things hard. Fall was a time of harvests for both the body and the spirit. Winter was a time for deep self-reflection and connecting with parts of yourself that were only available during the darkest months. The Harlows also learned a lot of useful skills. They worked with metals in ways that made alloys with special properties, materials that stayed at the same temperature no matter what the environment was, materials that reflected light in strange ways, and materials that made sounds when hit at certain frequencies. They made clothes by weaving fabrics from fibers that were grown just for this purpose. The clothes seemed to absorb light from the surroundings, making it hard to tell who was wearing them against some backgrounds. There was a whole wing of the house that could be called a laboratory, but that word doesn't really describe the work that was done there. Tables with fragile glass tools, flasks with brightly colored liquids, and stills that extract essences from rare plants. The Harlows made tinctures, elixirs, ointments, and powders that they used in their rituals for different things. Each substance was made using recipes that had been passed down through the years and improved over hundreds of years of testing. There was also a workshop on the property where ritual objects needed for ceremonies were made. During certain phases of the moon, certain metals were used to make tools. People shaped vessels into exact shapes and carved symbols into their surfaces that had to be used in a certain order. The family used special woods to carve masks that showed different parts of the forces they called upon in their rituals. The gardens had become real living places of peace. Each part had a different purpose and had plants chosen for their special qualities. Some places only had plants that bloom at night when the stars are out. Other parts of the garden had poisonous plants that weren't grown for bad reasons, but to learn more about how they change things. There were beds for medicinal herbs that the Harlows used to treat problems that regular medicine didn't know about. The animals that lived on the Harlows' land had become an important part of the ecosystem they had built. Each species had its own job to do in keeping the family's delicate balance. Crows kept watch and warned of any unwanted visitors. Cats patrolled the edges, marking their territory with their presence. Even bugs took part in this complicated system by pollinating ritual plants and making decorative webs that hung in certain parts of the house. The family had come up with a way to talk to each other without words by using signs and symbols. Marks left in certain places sent complicated messages. The way some things were placed showed how someone was feeling or what they needed. The way the curtains were hung in the windows even told other family members something. This was a visual code that had been passed down through the generations and was hard for outsiders to understand. The Harlows also kept a very detailed record of the stars. They looked at the night sky with tools they made themselves, keeping track of the movements of the stars and finding patterns that helped them with their work. They knew when certain planets would be in conjunction, when comets that were far away would pass by, and when eclipses would happen. They included these cosmic events in their ritual calendars as times of heightened power that were used for very important ceremonies. The estate stayed a world apart, a small world with rules that only people who had grown up there could understand. The Harlows followed their own path through time, keeping alive traditions that most people had forgotten or abandoned. They kept alive a flame of ancient knowledge that burned in the deep shadows of the Appalachian Mountains. The Harlows were cut off from the rest of the world, both physically and in time. In their world, the past, present, and future all seemed to be happening at the same time, in ways that didn't fit with the way we usually think about time. Within the limits of their property, they could hear echoes of things that hadn't happened yet, see shadows of things that had happened long ago, and live moments that weren't in the normal order of time. The house reacted more and more strongly to the people who lived there. Doors opened on their own, as if they knew what people needed without them saying anything. The stairs creaked in ways that sounded like they were making complicated musical patterns. Air drafts moved through the hallways in strange ways, going up when they should have gone down and bending at right angles for no clear reason. It was as if the structure had developed a basic form of consciousness after being around the family's habits for a long time. The Harlows had a unique bond with the dark. Unlike most people, they didn't fear it. Instead, they saw it as an important part of their lives. Some rooms in the house never saw the light of day because they were kept in a state of constant twilight on purpose. The family did deep meditations in these rooms, which changed their perceptions and let them see deeper layers of reality. They said that when it was completely dark and there were no visual distractions, you could hear whispers of truths that the light hid. The whole property acted like a living thing, breathing with the seasons and pulsing with energies that had their own cycles. The ground seemed to vibrate gently during some phases of the moon. The vibration was so small that only someone who stayed completely still could feel it. The trees around the house leaned in certain ways, not because of the wind, but because of invisible forces coming from the center of the property. The oldest family members had strange scars on their bodies that made complicated geometric shapes. These marks were not the result of accidents or violence. Instead, they were part of initiation ceremonies that every generation had to go through when they reached a certain level of maturity. Each symbol carved into the skin stood for something learned, a challenge met, or a secret made known. It was like reading a book written in body language, a story told through the skin. The area was unnaturally quiet for weeks in 1956. The birds stopped singing. Insects stopped buzzing at night. The wind even seemed to think twice before blowing. The Harlow estate was at the center of this silence. Its presence was so strong that it affected everything within a radius of miles. During this time, the family was working on a huge project that required complete focus and being cut off from the outside world. The rituals they did had changed over time to include more and more complicated parts. The days leading up to the main ceremonies were full of preparations. People would fast for part of the day, take baths in water treated with certain herbs, and recite texts they had memorized perfectly. The Harlows took these rituals very seriously. They knew that every move had to be perfect, that every gesture had to have meaning, and that even the smallest mistake could ruin carefully planned results. The family stayed in touch with certain places in the mountains around them. They held ceremonies in hidden clearings, using natural stone alignments to boost the energies they were working with. The Harlows kept and sometimes renewed the ancient paintings on the walls of deep caves, which served as underground sanctuaries. Isolated waterfalls collected water that was thought to be very pure in special containers during important religious events. The Harlows also came up with ways to help people reach certain mental states by using controlled breathing, holding certain body positions for a long time, and focusing on specially prepared objects. They could change how they saw the world. In these altered states of consciousness, they said they felt at one with their surroundings, felt like the lines between themselves and the world were fading, and saw dimensions that are normally hidden from normal perception. Over the years, the collection of ritual objects had grown a lot. There were now whole rooms set aside to store these things, each with a detailed list of what it was and why it was there. There were carved wooden masks on the shelves, and each one had a different, creepy look. Some of the ones carved with complicated symbols were so old that the wood had started to turn to stone. The Harlows would never let anyone else look at the things that were in the raw metal containers. The gardens kept growing in ways that didn't make sense according to normal plant science. When you looked at the plants from above, they made fractal patterns. Flowers opened their petals in waves that moved across the flower beds in a way that looked like they were dancing. Vines twisted together to make natural arches that connected different parts of the land. These green tunnels seemed to lead to other worlds when you walked through them at certain times of day. The family had come up with their own ways to keep track of time that didn't use regular clocks. They watched how some organic materials broke down, how fast some mosses grew, and how often certain animals came to the property. These natural markers gave a sense of time that was more fluid and organic than the mechanical accuracy of man-made tools. Time that breathed and changed based on what was needed at the time. The Harlows had a strange relationship with silence as well. They valued both times of complete silence and times of ritual chanting. There were certain times of day when everyone in the family had to be quiet and meditate. Their minds were all on the same frequency, which made a field of collective consciousness. During these times, imaginary visitors would feel a pressure in the air, as if the silence had turned into something solid. There were also private cemeteries on the property where Harlows from previous generations had buried their dead in their own ways. These graves didn't have regular headstones on them. Instead, trees were planted right over the graves, each one chosen for its unique qualities that matched the person buried there. The branches of these trees twisted in ways that seemed to tell silent stories about the people who fed their roots. The house was still the center of everything, and everything else revolved around it. Its walls had taken in decades of rituals, centuries of focused intentions, and generations of knowledge. It was more than just a building. It had turned into a living vessel of power, a place where many realities met. The Harlows treated it with respect because they knew they were both its guardians and its servants, in a relationship that went beyond just living there. Time kept moving on in the rest of the world, but on the Harlow lands, it seemed to fold back on itself, making strange pockets where the past and present lived together in harmony. The property had changed from just a piece of land surrounded by mountains into something that was alive in ways that didn't make sense to anyone. Over the years, the Harlows had learned a lot about the hidden rhythms that controlled the universe. They knew that everything vibrated at certain frequencies and that each object, living thing, and thought had its own energetic signature. With this information, they came up with ways to harmonize these frequencies, which made resonances that made their intentions stronger and brought their desires into the real world. The house kept getting bigger in ways that were impossible. New floors seemed to appear out of nowhere, along with rooms that no one remembered building, but that fit in perfectly with the rest of the house. There were stairs that seemed to defy gravity by spiraling up so tightly that they looked like they were going to disappear into an infinite point. The corridors went on for so long that they shouldn't have fit within the building's visible outer limits. This made it impossible to make sense of the building's layout. The mirrors all over the property had gotten stranger and stranger. Some mirrors showed not how the person looked at the time, but how they would look in the future, or how they looked in the past. Some of them showed reflections of faraway places, like windows into places that were miles away. Some of them acted as gateways to shared memories, showing scenes of events that none of the living people had seen, but that were deeply ingrained in the family's ancestral memory. The library had grown so much that it now took up an entire wing of the building. Its shelves grew like living things, making new shelves as more books were added to the collection. The books there had been written over thousands of years, and were about arts that modern society thought were dead or made up. There were grimoires that were bound in things that no one could identify, and their pages had texts on them that changed when they weren't being looked at directly. The Harlows had reading rituals that made studying feel like a holy ceremony. They did certain things before opening any old book. They burned incense made from rare resins, placed crystals around the study area, and said prayers that created circles of mental safety. They knew that some facts could be dangerous if they were misunderstood, that some truths could break minds that weren't ready for them, and that some information needed to be put into the right context to be understood without hurting anyone. The property changed in a way that could be seen in 1963, and the changes left permanent marks on the land around it. On a night without a moon, lights of many colors danced across the land, making patterns that burned into the soil and would last for years. The plants around these marks grew in a strange way, creating colors that didn't exist anywhere else in nature. The colors seemed to vibrate between impossible ranges. The family had also come up with ways to help everyone have lucid dreams together. On some nights, everyone would enter a state of conscious sleep at the same time. In this shared dream space, they could talk to each other without language barriers, share knowledge directly from mind to mind, and plan rituals with telepathic accuracy. During these nighttime meetings, they built complex imaginary landscapes, tested ideas about what consciousness is, and traveled to places that only existed in their dreams. The gardens had turned into real-life mazes. Paths wound their way between raised flower beds, taking imaginary visitors on carefully planned sensory journeys. Each section had its own microclimate, which was kept up by a mix of deep botanical knowledge and techniques that were almost magical. In some places, the temperature stayed the same all year round, while in others, the humidity changed in ways that didn't match any known weather pattern. The plants that the Harlows grew did more than just look nice or taste good. Some types were used to make dyes that changed people's states of mind in certain and controlled ways. Others gave the ingredients needed to make ointments that, when put on the skin, made the senses more sensitive or let people see energies that are usually invisible. Some flowers smelled so good that they put people into deep meditative states, which helped them get to deeper parts of their minds. The family had a respectful relationship with the natural world. Water was gathered from certain places, kept in containers made of certain materials, and treated in ways that gave it properties that went beyond just being chemically pure. They lit the fire for their rituals by rubbing together certain woods that had symbolic meanings, and they kept it going by carefully feeding it with certain fuels. The land on the property was worked with holy tools, turned over at times that were important to the stars, and fed with mixtures made from old recipes. The Harlows had a deep understanding of how different parts of reality were connected to each other. They were aware that different colors could make them feel different things, that different sounds could change how their bodies worked, and that different shapes could change how energy flowed. They used this knowledge in every part of their lives, from how they arranged their furniture in their homes to what they wore for different events. This made a space where everything worked together to make the others stronger. The workshop, where they made their ritual tools, had turned into a place of impressive dark creativity. Tools were hung on the walls in patterns that made intricate mandalas. There were projects on the workbenches at different stages of completion. Some masks were partially sculpted and needed finishing touches, while others were being carved with intricate patterns and vessels were being molded into shapes that didn't fit with normal symmetries. The smell of freshly cut wood, hot metal, and scented oils used to finish the pieces always filled the air in this room. The Harlows had to go through consecration processes for each object they made. These could take weeks or even months. It wasn't enough to just make something. It needed to be filled with intention and purpose through long exposure to certain influences. Objects were left in the moonlight for whole cycles, buried in holy ground for certain amounts of time, bathed in the smoke of special incense, and exposed to sound waves made by musical instruments made just for this purpose. The family also practiced ritual fasting that wasn't just about not eating. It was also about changing how they saw things. During these times of controlled abstinence, the Harlows said they had clearer minds, visions that showed them hidden layers of reality, and new ideas about problems that had been hard to solve in the past. People didn't see fasting as a sacrifice. They saw it as a way to improve themselves and tune their minds to higher frequencies. Over the years, the animals on the property had more babies, but they always kept the right number of them for the local ecosystem. There were crows that lived in the area for generations without ever leaving. Their families were as old as the Harlow family itself. Cats with all black fur patrolled the edges with almost military-like discipline. It looked like even the bugs followed invisible rules, working together in ways that biologists would say were impossible. The Harlows created their own ways to heal that combined deep knowledge of herbs with methods for controlling subtle energies. They treated problems not only on the physical level, but also on the emotional, mental, and spiritual levels, knowing that problems in one area would always affect the others. They used reading bodily signals, interpreting dreams, and analyzing perceived energy patterns through sensitivity gained over years of training to diagnose illnesses. The whole property worked like a huge tool for heightened perception. The house, the gardens, and the other buildings were all built and placed according to rules that made the best use of energy flows. There were certain places on the land where these flows came together to form vortices of power that the Harlows used in their rituals. In these places, reality seemed to be more flexible, more responsive to focused intentions, and more willing to bend to strong wills. The family's records had become an impressive account of both outside events and inside changes, such as improvements in their skills in certain arts, and new things they learned through careful experimentation. Every generation added to this living archive, keeping track of both successes and failures with the same level of care, knowing that both had important lessons for those who would come after. The Harlows kept traditions alive that the rest of the world had forgotten or chosen to give up on. Generation after generation. They were keepers of old knowledge, protectors of knowledge that went against what was known at the time, and artists who worked in the space between what was known and what was not. Their estate was still a safe place for this hidden knowledge, a bulwark against being forgotten, and a monument to the mysteries that refused to be solved by reason. Like layers of old varnish on a forgotten painting, the decades piled up on the Harlow estate, each one adding to the already complicated story of that strange family. The world outside was changing at a breakneck pace, accepting technologies that seemed like magic to people who lived before. But in the Kentucky mountains, in that remote area, time moved in its own strange way, unaffected by the changes that were shaking the rest of the world. The house had gotten so complicated that even the people who lived there sometimes found rooms they had never been to before. There were rooms that only showed up when the weather was just right, like when the air was very humid or the barometric pressure dropped below a certain level. There were secret doors hidden behind wooden panels that could only be opened by touching them in the right order. Only those who had been initiated into the family's deepest secrets knew how to do this. Over the years, the Harlows had perfected a way of life that went beyond what most people needed in the world. Not material things, but deeper and more subtle things drove their lives. Every day was set up according to rhythms that respected the cycles of nature and the alignments of the cosmos. Every task had a deeper meaning than just being useful. Cooking turned into magic. Gardening became a way to connect with the forces of the earth. Even just walking through the house's hallways was done with a sense of ritual. The library had grown to be very big. Its collections now included not only written texts, but also manuscripts with pictures that seemed to move when viewed from the side, scrolls so old that they had to be handled with special gloves to keep them from falling apart, and clay tablets covered in cuneiform writing that the Harlows had learned to read through a combination of academic study and insights gained in altered states of consciousness. There were whole sections devoted to systems of knowledge that modern academics would call pseudoscience or superstition, but the Harlows took them very seriously. For example, they studied astrology not as a fun hobby, but as a complex science that linked celestial movements to earthly events. Alchemy not just as primitive chemistry, but as a philosophy that sought both material and spiritual transformation. And geomancy not just as a way to read the energies flowing through the earth, but as a way to decide when and where to plant, build, and hold ceremonies. There were so many mirrors on the property that they formed a network of reflective surfaces that worked together to create a single system of perception. The Harlows found that they could use these mirrors to see more than one point on the property at the same time, giving them a panoramic view that went beyond normal physical limits. Even more amazing, they figured out how to use these mirrors as communication portals, sending thoughts and pictures between family members who lived in different parts of the country. In 1972, the Harlows bought land next to their own that had belonged to a family that chose to leave the area. This was a big change for the property. This new addition brought buildings that were quickly added to the existing complex. The family had built a very complicated system, and each building was changed and adapted to fit a specific need. The Harlows turned an old barn into an astronomical observatory. Instead of modern telescopes, they used their own instruments, which they said gave them more accurate views of the sky. The gardens grew to cover this new area, turning it into a real botanical kingdom, with hectares of carefully tended land. There were areas for medicinal plants, and each species was planted in soil that had been specially prepared to bring out its best qualities. Other areas had more unusual plants, types that the Harlows had found on secret trips to far-off places. These plants should not have been able to grow in that climate, but they did well because the Harlows knew more than what was normal for botany. The family came up with advanced ways to keep seeds alive that included both proper physical storage and religious rituals that were said to keep the seeds alive forever. Each type was stored in its own container, which had symbols on it that showed its properties, elemental affinities, and ritual uses. The Harlows kept seed banks with plants that the outside world had declared extinct. These plants survived only because that family worked hard to keep them alive. The rituals they did had changed to include advanced sound technologies. They found that certain vibrational frequencies had specific effects on states of consciousness, that harmonic combinations could cause certain perceptual experiences, and that exact rhythms could sync up brainwaves in group ceremonies. They made one-of-a-kind musical instruments based on a combination of traditional acoustics and sacred geometries, which made sounds that were not found anywhere else. The workshop for making musical instruments now had its own building, with walls covered in designs and diagrams that showed how physical shapes and sounds were related. The Harlows used woods that were good for sound, metals that were good for resonance, and animal hides that were made in traditional ways that made them last and sound great. Each instrument was both a work of art and a useful tool, with detailed carvings that not only looked good, but also amplified subtle energies. The family had also come up with ways to use scents in a ritualistic way. They knew that smells could have a big effect on how people feel and think, and that certain perfumes could bring back memories, change moods, and help people move between different states of consciousness. They grew large aromatic gardens, made essential oils using hand-hammered copper stills, and made incense that used dozens of ingredients based on recipes that had been passed down through the years. The smells in each room of the house were different, and they marked off areas that were meant for certain things. The Harlows had meditation rooms spread out across the property in such a way that each one was set up to help with a certain type of meditation. Some areas were set up for meditations that focused on visualization, while others were set up for practices that required complete mental silence. Still others were set up to help people have experiences of expanded consciousness that went beyond the limits of their own ego. The walls of these rooms were painted in certain colors, the cushions were made in the traditional way, and incense that was right for each type of practice was used to make them smell good. The family learned a lot about time cycles that went beyond what most calendars show. They understood that time was not linear but cyclical, that events repeated themselves in ascending spirals, and that patterns emerged when history was viewed through the right lenses. They kept detailed records of these events, noting when certain conditions were right for them to have more power. They used these temporal windows to do work that was very important. The animals on the property had become such an important part of the ecosystem that it would be hard to picture the place without them. Crows built nests in certain towers of the house, and their numbers stayed stable thanks to natural processes that seemed to meet their needs without them having to say anything. Cats walked around the grounds on paths that never changed, and patrols were done with perfect timing. Even the bugs took part in this complicated dance. For example, bees pollinated gardens in ways that increased genetic diversity, and spiders spun webs in ways that the Harlows saw as signs of the current energy conditions. The family had learned how to talk to these animals in ways that went beyond just training. They built relationships on respect for each other, recognizing that different intelligences are not less intelligent, and working together instead of trying to control each other. The animals were loyal to this method in a way that went beyond instinct. They acted in ways that showed they understood the bigger goals that were behind the property. The Harlows also practiced working with crystals and minerals. This wasn't just a passing trend, it was based on deep geological knowledge and an understanding of how subtle energies work. They got samples from certain places in the mountains, like deep caves where minerals grew in strange shapes and deposits that were exposed by landslides. Researchers carefully studied each stone, mapped out its unique features, and tried out different ways to use it through careful experimentation. There was a room just for this mineralogical work, and the walls were lined with shelves full of collections that were sorted in different ways. Some crystals were put together based on their chemical makeup, while others were put together based on their crystalline structure. Still, others were put together based on metaphysical properties that have been passed down through generations of secret traditions. The Harlows used these stones to make complicated geometric patterns that made energy grids that were said to affect the subtle fields around the property. The family created ritual bathing practices that turned simple hygiene into a cleansing ceremony. They got water from certain places, heated it in certain metal containers, and added herbs that were known to be good for cleaning both physically and energetically. People took these baths at certain times after getting their minds ready for them, and while they were reading texts they had memorized. Coming out of these ritual waters was seen as a symbolic rebirth, a renewal that went deeper than just cleaning the body. The Harlows knew that keeping the property in good shape required more than just physical work. They also had to pay attention to things that weren't visible. They did regular energy cleansings, which meant walking through all the rooms with certain incense, saying protective prayers, and strengthening the subtle barriers that kept unwanted influences away. This constant watchfulness made the family feel safe enough to keep working without any outside interference. And so they went on, weaving the complex tapestry of their amazing lives day after day. Each action added to a bigger pattern that could only be understood when seen as a whole. The Harlows were more than just people who lived in those mountains. They had become a natural part of the landscape, protecting secrets that flowed through the ground like veins carrying ancient and powerful blood. There are things that time can't completely erase in the Appalachian Mountains. Stories like the Harlows echo through the misty valleys and cloud-touched peaks, turning into legends that are hard to explain. The estate is still there, hidden in the hills, where reality seems to work by its own rules. The family kept doing what they had always done, keeping alive traditions that had been around for a long time. Each generation learned from the one before it and added to the knowledge that had been passed down to them. This created a line of wisdom that was completely separate from the modern world. They lived in a different dimension of existence, only touching our world in passing, like shadows crossing a lit path. The house was the same as it had always been, with stories written on its walls and the sound of footsteps echoing through its halls. The gardens kept growing with their impossible plants. The mirrors showed more than just faces, and the rituals went on forever under skies that watched without judging. It was like that piece of land had been cut out of reality and then sewn back together with threads of mystery and shadow. People still stayed away from those roads at night. People in the area still changed the subject whenever the name Harlow came up. There was a quiet agreement that some things should stay a mystery. It was best to keep some doors closed. Some truths were too hard to handle. And maybe that's how it should be. You don't have to understand everything completely. It's not necessary to light up every shadow. There are places between what we know and what we don't, between what we accept and what we can't, where stories like this one live. The Harlows were the guardians of these places, which are on the edges of places that most people would rather not think about. People who know the area say that the property is still there today. The mountains keep their secrets safe, and the mist that rises from the valleys at dawn still carries whispers of a family that chose to live outside of the normal world. Maybe they're still there, keeping alive a flame of knowledge that the rest of the world has chosen to forget by practicing their old arts. This is the story of the most cursed family in Appalachia. It's so mysterious that it's impossible to make a full record of it. A story that has been passed down through the years, not in official records but in the minds of those who know that some stories go beyond what most people can understand. If you've made it this far on this journey through the shadows of Appalachia, please give it a thumbs up so that more people can find stories that are on the edge of the unknown. To see more stories that make us question what we think we know about reality, subscribe to the channel. And in the comments, let me know if you think there are really places like the Harlow estate that are hidden away in the world's forgotten corners, until the next story takes us beyond the veil of everyday life. Nice.